Namaste and welcome back to the Bharat Vartha podcast. I'm your host, Roshan Karyappa. 23rd January marks the 125th birth anniversary of Subhash Chandra Bose. He was among the most significant nationalists and freedom fighters. And there were many facets of his life that were fascinating. And in this episode, we'll delve into all of those and also talk about some juicy counterfactuals, right? So, joining me for this conversation, I have Abhishek Banerjee, who is a columnist, scientist, and author. Welcome, Abhishek.
Thank you.
We also have our resident history enthusiast and expert, Vivek Ketan, joining us as well. Good to have you back, Vivek.
Thanks for having me back, Gary.
All right, guys, I think we have plenty of ground to cover in terms of Bose's legacy, his significance, impact, and his life itself. Maybe I'll come to you first, Abhishek. Some opening comments.
Yeah. So thank you for having me, Roshan. So for me, to talk about Netaji in a broad perspective, I would say that, he is one of the most interesting figures in history. And I'm not just saying that as a sort of, just a matter of fact sense. What I mean is that he is one person who makes history non-ideological. In the sense that, wherever any of us tries to study history, we all have our perspectives and we try to box history into the way we want it to see. But Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's life is sort of out of all this. And the amazing thing is that it will make a study of his life will make almost everyone uncomfortable. So, for instance, if you start with the Congress, people who are aligned with the Congress mindset, they would be uncomfortable because he had some difficult equations with both Nehru and Gandhi. If you look at the people who are perhaps more allied with the BJP's frame of looking at the world, they would be uncomfortable because Subhash Chandra Bose was an avowed leftist. And again, if you come at it from a leftist Marxist point of view, then also Subhash Bose's life forces you to face some of the most difficult facts. Because, and the reason for this is very interesting, is that we all know that Netaji went and, he joined hands with Hitler. But what is most important is that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose did not set out to join hands with Hitler. How did he find himself with the Nazis? Well, he left the British Empire. That's when he went to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was supposed to be the border state between the British Empire on one side and the communist Soviet Empire on the other side. So Netaji set off for the Soviet Union. And when he reached the Soviet Union, the Soviets sent him to meet the Nazis via the Italians. Right. So what happens is that, Netaji said, being a person with a leftist bent of mind, he went to the Soviet Union and the communists sent him over to the Nazis. So when the leftists, they have to talk about Netaji, they have to acknowledge the fact that the communists and the Nazis were actually very good allies at the time. They were fighting World War II together. So that's what I said. No matter which perspective you look at, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, his life will make you uncomfortable. And then and it's not just within India. Even when you are looking from outside India, you're looking at the situation from an American perspective. So, the American perspective on World War II is that they are fighting for freedom. But then if you're really fighting for freedom, but there's this person, Netaji, who is fighting for, independence of his country. So how is re-establishing the British Empire going to help the cause of freedom? So it's going to make everyone uncomfortable, even if you're looking at it and talking about, well, okay, he's an anti-imperialist force. Even then you are in trouble because Netaji comes to liberate India with the help of the Japanese imperialists, who are among the most cruel imperialists of that era. So no matter which perspective you are trying to take on history, Netaji's life will make you uncomfortable. And this is what is so interesting about him. And so what it really teaches you is that you have to look at history from a very unbiased academic point of view, because reality is not going to fit into anybody's box. So that is why I feel that Netaji is a figure who deserves to be truly studied more and more by historians, not just for the specific history, but as a lesson in how to do and how to understand history.
Right. Yeah, fantastic opening comments, Abhishek. I think, as you mentioned, Netaji certainly defies categories, ideologies, and so on. And plenty of these are, we can't sort of incorrectly take those views and juxtapose them to the current context as well, right? These were also, wartime allies and relationships. Vivek, let's take a step back and examine Netaji's rise to prominence and his relationship with the Indian National Congress. So for those of us who are not familiar with this phase, right, how that came to be, could you walk us through the sequence of events?
Yeah. So Netaji's life is perhaps the most fascinating life of all the Indian politicians and freedom fighters of that era. And as Abhishek explained, it's because, if you look at it from an ideological perspective, he has kind of, been at, every camp at different stages in his life. Now, the point is, why was it so? I mean, one has to go back to look at, what are the ideas and what is the environment in which Netaji was shaped, right? So Netaji was born in Cuttack in 1897. And then he went through in his teenage life, he dabbled a lot into, his spiritual anxieties, and uh, he was, going through a phase of spiritual crisis in 1910s. Then he discovers Swami Vivekananda's works, and he kinds of, finds a light, sort of springs up for him. And that remained an abiding faith for him throughout his life. He discovered Arvindo Ghosh, and he sort of married the Karma Yoga of Swami Vivekananda, which he interpreted his own way, with the service of humanity. And for service to humanity, he felt that the current political scenario meant that it meant he needed to work hard towards freeing India. So that's in 1910s, and he was always seen as a leader, even in his teenage. I mean, people around him sort of looked at him as a leader. He had that charismatic personality right from the beginning. Then once he, deferring to his father's wishes, he goes to Europe to study for IAS. In 8 months, he cracks the exam, shows how brilliant a guy he was as far as intellectual, capacities are concerned. But then, as a nationalist, he, leaves that within 3-4 months without joining the service, and carries that halo back when he comes back to India in 1921. Now that halo, gave him a certain prominence in the Congress party. Remember, 1921 is the time when India is going through non-cooperation movement, and C.R. Das, Deshbandhu Chitranjan Das, is the leader who is leading that movement from Congress in Bengal. So Subhash meets Gandhi when he comes back. Then he's sent to deputize for C.R. Das, and there he, becomes the most trusted lieutenant, a kind of an adopted son for C.R. Das. 1921 onwards, his rise in Congress comes. So non-cooperation movement is taken back. The politics kinds of, gets dulled in the early 1920s after that. Then C.R. Das, forms his own Swaraj party to get into constitutional politics. Subhas defers to him, even though he has got ideas which are more revolutionary, and works with him. Then Swaraj party gets into elections, and Subhash Bose is appointed. I mean, they win the elections, and Subhash Bose is appointed as CEO of Calcutta Municipal Corporation. Now, this is a phase of his life that is not very well, spoken about. I think a lot of what Subhash Bose became lies in his roots in his teenage, as well as his work till 1926 with C.R. Das. Most of his ideas, his ability to organize, his charismatic persona, his fiery oratory, all of that is something which is in evidence, and he becomes, let's say, a man, a leader in that phase. So when I'll talk about is to what are the kind of influences that he goes through in that period, later in this segment. But you see, he was someone, let's say, unlike Nehru, he was someone who had hard administrative experience. He really put his heart and soul into his role as the CEO of Municipal Corporation in Calcutta. He saw the Indian reality very close in his very early age, which shaped him. And the only abiding faith, unlike the left and right kind of categories that people try to put him into and then become comfortable because he was all over the place, the only abiding faith which you can see in him is that he wanted India freed, and everything else flowed from that. So in that sense, he was a very practical man. He was not a doctrinaire, let's say, unlike some of the other politicians of the era.
Right. And his views of Purna Swaraj also put him at odds with some of the tallest leaders of the Congress, right? And Abhishek, do you want to talk about that 1938 period where he comes into the Congress and there's a whole lot of clash of egos, so to speak, right? He goes up against Gandhiji, Nehru. Talk us through that.
Yeah. So, so one of the things that we have to fundamentally understand of that era was that is that we tend to misunderstand the Congress of today as the Congress of that time. What you have to understand is that time the Congress was more of a political party of the kind that we see in the US today, where, so for instance, we just saw that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, they started out as bitter rivals. I mean, Kamala Harris said some of the most insulting, cutting comments about Biden earlier in the campaign, and then they came together. So, it was more of an umbrella party at that time, and everybody had their own views, and they were all jockeying with each other and lobbying with each other. So, so naturally the Congress had its own factions within itself. So Subhash Chandra Bose was aligned towards the more radical leftist faction of the Congress. And then there was sort of the old Congress, which was represented by Gandhi, and it enjoyed the blessings of Gandhi, and Nehru was the main figure in that. And so each of them wanted to control the party, so to say. And it was really more of the way we see primary elections in the US today happening inside the party. They're bitter, they're contested. And it was in this framework that these conflicts took place. So at that time, as was happening all across many parts of the sort of colonized world, the radical left was gaining more in strength. And so increasingly, Subhash Bose's views began to carry the party. So the party began to sort of move away from the way Gandhi and Nehru wanted it to be. And so there is one incident that I must mention here, which some people would find quite juicy. So in 1928, so this is almost 10 years before the big fallout between the two, Gandhi and Netaji, is that Motilal Nehru, he writes a letter to Mahatma Gandhi, saying that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel is the hero of the hour, but I feel that at this point, the Congress party needs the leadership of a younger generation. And then he literally says, so Motilal Nehru is writing the letter, and he says that as leader of the younger generation, my son Jawaharlal should become the president of the Congress. So Mahatma Gandhi, it is what it is. And then Mahatma Gandhi replies to him, and these are almost his exact words. He writes back, my dear Motilal, I accept your point that, it should be led by a younger generation. And then he says that there is some time left for Jawahar to wear the crown. So these are his exact words, these are Mahatma's exact words. There is some time left. So while some time is left, why don't you become the president of the Congress? So in 1928 at the Kolkata session, Motilal Nehru becomes the president of the Congress. And less than a year later at the Allahabad session, he makes his son, essentially he passes the presidency of the Congress to his son Jawaharlal. So from this you can see that there were groups within the Congress at that time which had started operating, within a sort of cozy club mentality. And then there was an in-group and there was an out-group. And there was this constant tussle. And so Netaji was sort of part of the out-group, and he was perhaps it was more of the Bengal faction of the Congress. And within the Congress, he formed this thing called Forward Bloc. And it was more to the left, and it was more revolutionary in its aim of resisting. So inevitably, these forces were coming into conflict. And by this time, Jawahar was actually wearing the crown. So that's great. So they all came together, and then there is the Congress session. I believe this is the Tripuri session.
1939.
The Haripura session. Is that the next one? I think Haripura is the next.
Haripura is the first one in which Subhash was.
It's a little mixed up. I'm not as much up to date with all the numbers and the facts as Vivek is. So, and then Mahatma's candidate is Pattabhi Sitaramaiah, and he loses. At that time, believe it or not, parties had real elections. So he loses the presidency of the Congress to Netaji, and then Netaji comes to power. But Gandhi, he holds moral sway over the party. So he says that the loss of Pattabhi Sitaramaiah is my own defeat. And then Netaji steps down. By this time, World War II has already started. So he is put under house arrest, and that is where he makes up his mind that he is now going to, because so what exactly happened at the time was the British government, when it declared war, I believe it was 3rd September 1939, when the British government declared war on Germany, Britain and France. Along with Britain, the British Empire also declared war. And I believe the Governor General of the time was, the Viceroy of the time was Lord Linlithgow. And Lord Linlithgow, he declared war on behalf of the Indian Empire as well. And that was the problem that the Congress had with the British government, that how dare you declare war without consulting us. So they all resigned. And they were thrown into jail, and so the British thought that they can just suppress everything, and for the most part they succeeded as well. So that's when Netaji decided that this is probably the time to leave India. So he said that so his first aim is to go to Afghanistan, because that is just outside the British Empire. The British never ruled Afghanistan. It's a graveyard of empires. Everybody wants to rule Afghanistan and nobody can. So he manages to goes to Peshawar, then he crosses the border into Afghanistan, and then his aim is to go to the Soviet land, which he considers land of revolution. So he goes over there, and there he meets with the Russian embassy, and then they put him in touch with the Italians. That's where, so it's this incredible story of daring. The Italians first smuggle him out of Russia, because at that time, communist Russia is aligned with the Nazis. So they say that, you should go over to Germany. And the reason for that is the following, because, at that time, the Germans are fighting British troops in North Africa. That's Rommel's Afrika Korps. So the Afrika Korps is fighting with the British in North Africa, and they have pushed the British all the way to Tobruk. And it's actually incredible to see. So the Germans on the one side, and then the British force on the other side is made up of Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, everyone. And so these captured soldiers who are being captured by Rommel, and Rommel is running this blistering campaign. At some points, he has 300 tanks, and the other side has 3,000 tanks, but somehow Rommel just keeps winning. And he pushes the British to Tobruk, to El Alamein, he pushes them into Egypt, and Rommel then flies back to Berlin, and he makes this proclamation that, we are going to take over Egypt. So the Germans are just cutting through North Africa at that time. So then the communists say that, why don't you go over to that side, over to the Western theater? And so the Italians, they disguise him as one of their diplomats. They name him Orlando Mazzotta. That's a nice Italian sounding name. And so they smuggle him all the way to Italy. From there, he makes his way to Germany. That's where he meets the captured soldiers from the Afrika Korps. And he forms the Indian Legion. That is the start of his idea of an Indian national army. But of course, after that, he eventually leaves. He makes this daring crossing across the ocean all the way to Japan to meet, the Japanese emperor and the Japanese government. And, so he goes in a submarine, in a U-boat. I believe it was in a German U-boat. He starts and he makes the crossing into a Japanese submarine. So it's just an incredible story of daring all around. So I may not have got all the dates perfectly because I'm not a historian, but I think I have the broad narrative.
Right. Fascinating. So Vivek, let's get to the first of our counterfactuals, right? And I want to come back to the, whole Gandhiji versus Netaji question. What if Gandhiji had not insisted on Bose giving up the Congress leadership? What do you think would have happened?
Yeah, so you see, Bose was basically president for 2 terms, right? In the first term, he was appointed president, and that was with the blessing of Gandhiji. But Bose was his own man, a very strong personality, and he had got very definite ideas about as to how the anti-colonial struggle was to be waged, and that has been something which was there since 1927-28. At that point, Nehru and Bose were sort of aligned in terms of pushing the anti-colonial struggle towards more forthright means rather than just agitation and petition, etc. But by 1936-37, Nehru is someone who defers all the time to Gandhi, but that's not the case with Bose. He had very definite ideas. I think the primary reason for that was Bose was a leader in his own right. He was seen as the leader of Bengal right from 1920s. After the death of C.R. Das, he was the most preeminent leader of Bengal, and in that sense, he commanded a complete following of one part of Congress, right? So in 1939, because Bose and Gandhi didn't agree as to how Congress should take forward the anti-colonial movement, Bose was asked to not contest the elections, right? Bose was also in favor of actually stepping down, but he, because of pressure from his Bengal colleagues, he contested the elections and he actually won. Much to his own surprise, he didn't think that he will win the elections, right? So what if he was not asked to step down? He was not asked to step down by Gandhi. I mean, the method of Gandhi has been non-cooperation, right? So he basically pulled that out against Bose also. So Bose was supposed to appoint the Congress Working Committee in 1939 after he won the election, and Gandhi had complete control over that. So they had a meeting, and Gandhi said that you are the president, you appoint the committee. uh, all the Congress Working Committee members before that had resigned. So Nehru sort of tried to, broker a compromise that you reappoint the ones who have resigned and put two more of yours. But Gandhi refused to cooperate on that. He said that you are the president, you appoint. So Bose took the message and he resigned, right? Now, what if Gandhi had, not forced him to resign? You see, the differences between Gandhi and Bose were irreconcilable in terms of how the movement was sought to be taken forward, right? So I don't see a scenario where Gandhi would have, I mean, in that sense, Gandhi should have agreed to accept Bose as his leader also, which was unthinkable at that point, right? Most of the Congress, even though, Bose won the election, but as far as the Congress leadership is concerned, Gandhi commanded an absolutely, unquestioned following. So it's impossible to see Gandhi deferring to Bose in accepting him as the leader and working under his command as to how the anti-colonial movement has to be taken forward. So it's a counterfactual which does not, really take off the ground in that sense. I think more interesting counterfactual is that if Bose would have survived, or at least would have survived, to remain in Indian polity post 1945, what would have happened? That's a very interesting question that we'll talk about in the next segment.
Right. So Abhishek, I mean, you alluded to the formation of INA briefly. This was, I would say, I mean, first organized armed struggle of the 20th century, right? From an Indian perspective. So talk us through the foundation of INA and, what it meant for the freedom struggle.
Yeah. So so in Germany, when he was in Nazi Germany, he did not really found the INA. He founded something called the Indian Legion, which I believe was the name. And it was made out of Indian soldiers who had been captured by Rommel's Afrika Korps. But I believe it was a small organization, and Bose soon got fed up with what was happening, because it was quite clear that first of all, I mean, Hitler was a highly mercurial leader anyway, and on top of that, Hitler didn't have that much. He didn't really care about Indian independence, and Bose is over there, and they don't really have any. So the Germans don't have any conceivable hope of reaching India very soon. So he gets frustrated with that, and that's when he decides that it's better off if I go to the Pacific Theater, because by then the war has also started changing a lot of form, because by then the Nazis and the communists have broken their alliance. So Hitler is no longer with the communists. Hitler has in fact invaded the Soviet Union. So the way that Netaji starts looking at Hitler has probably started changing by then. And on top of that, the contours of the war have changed. There has been Pearl Harbor. Japan has brought the United States into the conflict. So at this point, Bose makes the only decision that could have been most opportune at that point is that you go over to Japan, you go over to the Pacific Theater, because the Japanese, they are going over the Philippines, they are going over the Solomon Islands, they have brought the war into the Pacific Theater, and they are even beginning to threaten Australia. There was a serious threat to Australia at that time. So he thought that that he could go and enter India from that direction, because that is the only one that sort of made sense. And even the British were starting to move some reinforcements into Southeast Asia, because they were realizing that the threat was getting closer. And so Bose moves over to Japan. That's where the Japanese, they give him a bit more of a slightly better welcome than the Germans do. And then I believe he comes over to Singapore. And so that was one of the biggest defeats that the British suffered in the war, because the Japanese were on the offensive. The Japanese had lesser troops. it was definitely a much less outfitted organization than the fortress that the British had at Singapore. I believe General Percival was the head of the commander of the British at Singapore, and Churchill kept writing to him saying that you should fight to the last man, but Percival, he just gives up and he just surrenders to a force that is much smaller than his, and that was probably the biggest embarrassment that the British suffered in the whole war. That the fortress of Singapore fell pretty easily to the Japanese. So when Bose arrives over there, by now there are huge numbers of captured Indian soldiers who from the British ranks, and he starts developing the INA, and he has decided to make his way through Myanmar and go all the way to the borders of India. But unfortunately, the war is turning against him because by now the Americans because the Americans were totally thrown off by the attack on Pearl Harbor. And they were just shocked, and they were stunned by the kind of resistance that the Japanese put up at Guadalcanal and at Bataan in the Philippines. So there was the Bataan Death March that they captured the American soldiers and put them on this 3-day march where pretty much everybody died. It's one of the most horrific events in the war. So, but the Japanese, they are holding off. They're holding their own against the Americans, and that was in the beginning. But then the Americans started using their industrial strength, and at one point they were bringing out one ship every day. They called it Liberty ships. So there was basically no way that Japan could have won the war. By the time Bose reaches the borders of India, it is essentially already too late because the war is almost already over. The Americans, they are firebombing into Tokyo. They are attacking Japanese cities at will. Right. So he sort of arrives on the borders of India, and by then he has become sort of a tragic figure. But he tries to continue, and he tries to continue the war, but the tide has totally turned against him. And so the Japanese resistance is at end, and there's really not that much he can do.
Right. Yeah, that's very comprehensive, Abhishek. Vivek, I want to talk about, and Abhishek mentioned this as well in a couple of his answers. Bose's relationships, particularly with the with the Axis powers, right? So Germany, Italy, and Japan. Particularly, you could talk about his relationship with Hitler and Mussolini and the others. I mean, because oftentimes you hear of, this thing in the present context that, hey, I mean, Bose allied with, Bose partnered with someone like Hitler. Right. So to what degree was that overlap? To what degree was that, purely circumstantial, situational, and so on and so forth?
Yeah. You see, in Congress Party, there were two, leaders with international orientation, right, who had a grasp of, what international situation was. One was Nehru, and second was, of course, Bose. So Bose had spent about, 3 years in Europe in 1930s, and he had been to most of the major countries other than Russia at that point. And he had forged, deep relationships in the government circles, in countries like Germany, France, in Austria, etc. And most importantly, in Ireland. I mean, he was seen as a hero in Ireland, and there's a lot of parallel between Bose's life and the, life of Irish revolutionaries, right? So, as I said, his teenage influences and early influences in life had made him a very practical man. He was not a doctrinaire like Nehru. I mean, he spoke at length about various issues, and he had very firm convictions. But his one abiding faith was that he had to fight for the country, and India needs to be freed. And the other was to, just sort of take what's best for the country at that point of time, and not be, beholden to one particular idea, right? So Bose was a very well-known international figure, and his socialist bent of mind was something which was also very well known. So he was a very well-respected figure internationally. Now, as far as Axis powers are concerned, I think he got along very well with Tojo, and he had deep admiration and respect for Japanese, and that was something which was reciprocated, and that's why he was able to build the INA with the help of Japanese. I think he had just one meeting with Hitler, and I think both perhaps didn't like each other very much, right? I mean, both sort of bristled after that meeting and saying a lot. In fact, there are stories that he actually said a lot of things in the meeting itself. It is the interpreter who sort of softened what Bose said to Hitler, right? So he didn't like him very much. As far as Mussolini, Italian leader, is concerned, he had a lot of respect for Italians and for Mussolini. he was ambivalent towards some of the aspects of what Mussolini was doing, but he was not as hostile to Mussolini as he was to Hitler. So in that sense, you see, and his attitude towards these leaders was not shaped merely by the personality of these leaders, but by, on the one hand, the circumstances in which he found India, right? And on the other, his understanding of European politics, which he acquired in 1930s firsthand during his sojourn to Europe. So it's a very, he has a complex take. And the overriding factor is that it's horses for courses policy. His understanding when he went to Hitler and then to Japanese was that Axis powers will win the war. And that was something which he didn't materialize. I mean, by 1943, when he was in a position to attack India, the war had changed. Americans had come in, as Abhishek explained beautifully and in detail, that Americans had come in and British war efforts had received a boost. And there was basically no hope for, Indian National Army to invade India and win the war.
Right.
So that's what it is.
Right. So Abhishek, just with other facets of Bose's life, Netaji's life, even his death or rather disappearance is also shrouded in mystery, right? I mean, the popular theory is that he died in August of 1945. After his overloaded Japanese plane crashed in what is now Taiwan. But again, there are various theories regarding this, including the one that he returned to live in UP as Gumnami Baba, right? Do you subscribe to one or many of these theories? I mean, what is most plausible?
I mean, see, this is, now we are genuinely in the domain of pure speculation. So, I mean, if you think about it, so what happened in August of 1945? I mean, there is the bombing of Hiroshima, and after that there is Nagasaki. And at that time, the Japanese militarists, they were, so the way the Japanese militarists, they were determined to fight the war till the bitter end. They didn't want to, they would rather die than give up power. So, but the Americans, they took over Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they were coming for the Japanese. And so the Americans, they decided to shorten the war by dropping the nuclear bomb. Now, after that, at that point, there was no chance of Japan winning. Now, would it be really possible for somebody to come all the way from Japan and then, from the Japanese lines and make it back to India? Now, the thing is, what I would say is, if anybody can actually do it, it's probably Subhash Chandra Bose. If there is one person who's actually capable of doing this, I mean, if you follow his journey, escaping from Calcutta, then going to Peshawar, escaping to Afghanistan, to the Soviet Union, then going to Italy, then Germany, then crossing the ocean in 2 U-boats, coming to Japan, passing through Singapore. So if there is one man in this world who can actually come back to India despite that, that is probably Netaji. But how plausible it is? Probably not very plausible. And if he comes back to India, well, I mean, why would we have to ask? Why would he stay on as Gumnami Baba? Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he announce himself? So what I find in character, if you so to say, that something that matches his in character, is he capable of crossing the lines? And now, okay, he might have died in a plane crash. Nobody can stop that. But suppose he survives the plane crash. Is it possible for a man to come all the way back to India? If there is one man who can do it, it is Netaji. But so that is in character. And what is out of character? Coming to India and then not making himself known. I just don't see, and that is the point at which India is becoming independent. I see no reason why he would stay hidden. That is the part that is totally out of character. So managing to come back to India, in character, staying Gumnami, out of character. This is what I can see.
Right. Vivek, any comments on that?
Yeah. So you see, actually in 2021, I don't find this question very interesting. And I tell you why. Netaji, whether he survived or didn't, he was out of Indian polity from 1945, right? And I agree with Abhishek that Netaji was physically brave, not just, politically brave, he was physically brave. There had been speculation that, the government of India had promised Britain that they will hand over Subhash if he is known, to Britain as a war criminal, etc. I don't think he would be deterred by that. I mean, there has been speculation that he was deterred by some of these things not to announce his, his arrival, etc. And in any case, I mean, there are people who believe that he is alive. I mean, he is definitely not alive today. It's difficult to imagine a 123-year-old Netaji, right? So
Yeah.
I think more interesting question is that, and I think
Yeah.
it would have been better for Netaji also that he would have been captured along with his soldiers in 1945. And then what would have happened if he would have come back, in India as a war criminal?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's actually my next question to you, which is, one more counterfactual. What if he had actually come back, right? What if he had survived that crash, or had got captured, as you mentioned, right, and come back to India? How do you see that India would have changed as a result of that?
So I will look at, some of the events, especially between 1945 and 47, and see what kind of impact Netaji, would have had if he would have come back alive. And the only way I see him coming back alive was that if he would have been captured and brought back to India for a trial as a war criminal by British government, right? If he would have come back, he would have received a hero's welcome in India. The reason why British decided to leave was the string of small mutinies which happened between 1945 and 46 in various parts of India and Indian Army, and a big naval mutiny which happened in Bombay in 1946. I think the intensity and the spread of those mutinies would have been even bigger if Netaji would have come, and he would have been seen as the liberator of India. Netaji's popularity in 1938-39 itself, and particularly in 1940s, was rivaling Gandhi. By 1945-46, he would have eclipsed popularity of Gandhiji. And I think he would have been able to completely command Congress Party, which was the only national organization of consequence at that point, right? And he would have been able to sideline all the other leaders who would have not been, in favor of seeing Netaji as their leader. So he would have commanded the unprecedented kind of following at that point, and so that's one part. The second part is what would have happened to the partition at that point, right? I think, like Nehru, he too had as much blinkers as far as Muslim polity of the time is concerned, and he would have been as helpless as Nehru was or Gandhiji was as far as the partition question is concerned. Even though he had a certain spiritual side, he was not doctrinaire, like Nehru, but he believed in Hindu-Muslim unity, and unlike some of the other leaders like Savarkar, he was not exposed to the to the seamier side of Muslim polity, right? And he was unaware of it in a sense. So I think he would have been as bewildered, as taken in by surprise at the turn of events. But I think administratively, perhaps he would have managed it much better than Nehru did. He would have insisted on some sort of guarantee from Pakistan in order to safeguard their minorities, much better guarantees than what Nehru could get from Liaquat Ali Khan, right? So that's what I think. 1947, he would have easily become the Prime Minister of India if he wanted. He would have been the first Prime Minister of India. I have no doubt about that. His popularity would have been at a scale where Gandhi would not have been able to overrule, public opinion of that scale, right? When Gandhi overruled Patel, he was overruling basically the decision of the Congress Party. He was not overruling public opinion. For all his greatness, Patel was not a mass leader in the sense that Nehru was, and Nehru easily would have won a public contest against Patel, but he wouldn't have won that against Bose. Even Gandhi wouldn't have been able to prevent from that. So what would have happened if Bose had become the first Prime Minister of India? So let's look at it. I mean, it's a big counterfactual. I mean, it will take a lot of time to discuss that in detail. But let's look at it, in three parts, right? Nehruism essentially stands on three pillars, as we understand Nehruvian ideology and policy. So one is his, a domestic economic policy, which is around planning and socialist, control and, capturing the commanding heights of economy by the state. I think Subhash Bose was of the same opinion. He would have started with, with the same kind of policies, but because he was not doctrinaire socialist, he would have realized the mistake of that. And if he would have lived as Prime Minister as long as Nehru did, I think he would have made a course correction. But starting off, I don't think there would have been any change. Now look at the the other pillar of Nehruvian policy, which is secularism, right? I think again Subhash Bose was of the same ideological orientation, but because he was again not doctrinaire, he would have been more even-handed, and the kind of deformities that we saw, which came through secularism in India, whereby Hindus were sort of discriminated against, in very important ways, and that is something which continues till date. That's not something which Subhash Bose would have allowed. That's my sense. But the biggest difference he would have made would have been in foreign policy. He was, as he has proved in the 1940s, he had no, ideological inclination which made him compromise national interest, right? So I think he would have understood the China threat much better. Because he had a military bent of mind, he would have invested a lot in building Indian military, which would have withstood much better in 1962 war, if that war would have come. So in that sense, Bose, I think, would have been a much better leader. But some of the mistakes which Nehru made, which in hindsight we know very well, I think even Bose would have made.
Right. Fascinating. Abhishek, you want to extend that counterfactual, maybe add a few comments and then talk about Bose's significance today in India 2021?
So that was actually a very, I agreed with almost everything Vivek said over there about the three kinds of legacy that Bose would have. Yes, there is probably no doubt that he would have, if he had been captured and he had come to India, he would probably have become an absolute hero, and he would probably ended up as prime minister. And yes, as far as economic policy is concerned, it is hard to see any distinction because both of them had very extremely left-wing economic views. Yes, but I would say the way I would see, once India becomes independent and, the British are no longer ruling us, then the character of every leader comes out. And there is where I feel there is a very strong difference between Bose and Nehru. The distinction is that Nehru was a person who was, who genuinely was intimidated by the British and the Americans. I believe Bose didn't have that in him. First of all, one of the reasons was that Bose had truly been around the world, like literally been around the world in, ghat ghat ka pani pike. So he genuinely had no, but there was a reason why Nehru was so inclined towards a certain particular worldview, because he had always been cushioned and conditioned in that one perspective. But Bose had been all around the world. So he could understand and appreciate everybody's perspective. So he would not take this doctrinaire thing that, so this is the culture, this is the superior culture, this is the best culture. So as long as we adopt that culture, then we are doing fine. And that's why some of the deals, like Vivek also said, that happened, some of the compromises that struck. So partition would have happened. I have no doubt partition would have happened no matter who came, because it was by that time, again, it was an unstoppable force. But some of the deals that were struck during partition, they would have definitely been more fair, because Bose would have bargained. So one thing that Netaji understood was to, press for his self-interest. So the thing is, so when he was trying to get India independent, that was his self-interest, and he was willing to, do whatever it takes. So with some of the deals that Nehru made, which were probably India ended up on the receiving end, that would probably not have happened, because Bose would have asked for fairer deals, like for the minorities in Pakistan, and then some divisions of the treasuries as well. There were some disputed points. I should add one point that while the mutinies played a huge role and it really psyched out the British, and they thought it's better time to get out. On top of that, Britain was also bankrupt, which played a huge role. And the British, they were hanging. They needed the European recovery program from the US government. And at that time, so today again, it's very hard to imagine today, but at that time the trust between the Americans and the British was not very high. And a lot of Americans were leery of giving loans to the British because they saw the British as empire builders. And a lot of Americans actually blamed the British for getting into the war. I mean, Roosevelt, so there is this very significant event, which should be a significant event in Indian history, but it's rarely mentioned. There is this meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill, I believe, in Argentina. And over there, Roosevelt goes nuts against, he goes nuts against Churchill, saying it's because of you guys, and your imperialist ambitions that American boys are dying all over the world. So a lot of Americans at the time saw that, they had been dragged into this war because of all the imperial European powers. So they did blame them, and they were very suspicious of any empire building countries, most prominently being Britain. So that was also another reason that the British were under a lot of pressure to leave India. But so if suppose Subhash Bose had become the first prime minister, economic policy would have probably continued down this same track till now. But today, for India's legacy today, I would say the thing to look at is what I started with. That when you are trying to look at history, come with a non-ideological view. That is what the life of Subhash Bose can teach you. That don't try to make history, don't try to force history into your box. Look at it as it is and understand that, no matter which perspective you take, there are all perspectives, all sorts of perspectives, and they all lead to various conclusions. So history is very complex. Don't try to oversimplify things. Try to investigate more. What we can learn from Subhash Bose, two amazing things. One is an unqualified patriotism. The other is a tremendous level of daring. So these are the two big legacies that we can always take away from Netaji's life. One is that be a patriot. The other thing is don't fear. And maybe I would add a third thing is don't be intimidated, because among our so-called founding fathers or whatever, or founding persons, one of the things that we see is a very deep-seated admiration bordering on inferiority complex towards the British, with the exception of Dr. Ambedkar, and the other exception would be Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. These are the two people who genuinely did not see the ruling class. They saw it. Everybody saw the injustice, but there were some groups who were totally immersed in admiration of the rulers. And if you look at it from a perspective of that age, you will find this even among many of the ruling class in Bengal at the time. Because if you look at a map of the world, you see this tiny little Britain sitting there, and you see this, and they are ruling all over India and 22% of the world. You can imagine why they would feel an inferiority complex. So I don't blame them for it. But this inferiority complex did exist. So the three things that we can learn from Netaji are: be a patriot, have an immense amount of daring, and the third thing is do not be intimidated. History keeps changing. Britain was ruling us yesterday. Tomorrow we might be ruling Britain. So don't be intimidated by these things. So these are the three things I would say we can learn from Netaji. Beyond that, don't try to put him into your ideological boxes. It's never good. So.
Fantastic. Vivek, so ahead of the 125th birth anniversary, there is an effort to resurrect Netaji, and I think it's mainly led by the BJP. In fact, Prime Minister Modi himself is part of a panel that will commemorate Netaji. How much of this is sort of a political project versus there being some kind of a real sincere overlap between what Bose stood for and what the BJP or the current government stands for?
Yeah. So my sense is that Prime Minister Modi would find some affinity towards Netaji, and the reason for that would be that Netaji was a great administrator. That's one part of his life that is not spoken about much, and in present times, I don't think there is a greater administrator than Prime Minister Modi, right? The other thing is that if Netaji would have been there, India would have, put in place military-industrial complex way back in 1950s, the contours of which Prime Minister Modi is, trying to put today, right? So these are, some of the things which I think Prime Minister Modi would admire about Netaji at a personal level, not just as a historical figure. Now, BJP is trying to resurrect Netaji. See, Netaji has a resonance in Bengal which is unrivaled, even today, right? It's rather unfortunate that he is seen as a Bengali leader today and not as an Indian leader. In terms of the resonance that he generates, it's more in Bengal than outside India. But in Bengal, he has a cult following. Across ideological divides in Bengal, right? In many ways, the legacy of Netaji, in terms of what he was able to do, falls on BJP. His views, his life, his career is about, he was a staunch nationalist, and everything else was subordinated to that. That is something that you can, say about present-day BJP rather than any other political formation, right? The other is that Netaji believed in a very strong, prosperous, self-confident, self-reliant India. Now that is again something which BJP is actually trying to do today, right? So there are a lot of parallels. It's rather unfortunate that present Congress party does not seem to be carrying the legacy of its independence, movement stalwarts, and that's kind of a sorry thing for Indian polity in many ways. So Netaji is not confined to a particular political formation or party. His life, as Abhishek said, is cuts across party lines, cuts across ideological divides, and you cannot put him in one bucket or the other. So even though Patel didn't belong to BJP, but he'd seen his legacy is something which is seen as BJP's legacy today. And then in times to come, it's very well possible that Netaji's legacy would be something which will be seen as BJP's legacy, because everybody else is kind of not willing to learn from his life and take his legacy forward.
Great. Yeah, that's a fascinating note to end the podcast on. I guess, some people, whether it's Patel or whether it's Bose, are beyond parties, beyond ideologies in some sense. This has been an amazing conversation, Abhishek and Vivek. Thank you so much for bringing so much of depth and nuance into the conversation. I really appreciate it, and really hope that history is taught in this way to all of us in the future. So thank you so much again, Abhishek and Vivek.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll hope to see you on a different podcast. I hope you liked this podcast. If you did, please share this with your family and friends. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Vartha. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Vartha to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvartha.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.